A real jaguar called El Jefe, which is Spanish for the boss, and he's earned that nickname. Here he is, he's caught on video, and he's the only known wild jaguar in the United States.
For decades, the jaguar was almost a ghost in America, seen in fading photographs, whispered about by hunters, and then seemingly gone. But now, something extraordinary is happening. 8 wild jaguars have crossed back into American territory, and cameras have captured moments that researchers never expected to see. These are not zoo animals or carefully relocated cats. They are powerful predators moving through forests, mountains, and remote borderlands on their own terms. And what the cameras recorded next has left wildlife experts questioning everything they thought they knew. Why are these jaguars returning now? Where did they come from? And what happens when America's most elusive big cat begins reclaiming its territory? 11 seconds that changed everything. Chris Schnaufer wasn't expecting to find anything special. He's a volunteer, 63 years old, and on that spring morning he'd made a rough, off-trail hike across a hillside in the Sky Island Mountains to check on a camera he'd hidden near a remote watering hole. Getting there wasn't easy. He followed an old bear trail, deliberately stomping and talking to himself so he wouldn't startle anything he couldn't see.
I'm walking backwards on the trail back to the camp. I'm walking down the trail and mom and 2 cubs. So I am continually to walk backwards.
When he finally reached the camera and pulled the memory card, he had no idea what was sitting on it. Back home, scrolling through the footage, he stopped cold. There, time-stamped just after sunset in March, was a jaguar. Not a mountain lion, not a bobcat, a jaguar, drinking at the exact spot he'd guessed an animal might pass through. He said later that he gasped out loud, alone in his own living room. The cat on that footage would come to be known as Cinco, the 5th individual jaguar. The University of Arizona's Wildcat Research and Conservation Center has documented since it started serious monitoring work in 2011.
A jaguar called Cinco has been seen again in Arizona. The University of Arizona Wildcat Research and Conservation Center tells us.
He was first caught on camera in November 2025, and by the time spring 2026 rolled around, he'd already been detected more than a dozen times, moving through the same stretch of borderland mountains south of Tucson. But Cinco isn't the whole story. Just months earlier, in December 2025, a different camera caught a different cat entirely. And this one may be even harder to believe. A landscaper named Jason Miller had a pair of cameras stashed in a rocky, forested patch of land near the Mexican border. For days, they'd caught what he called stunning but routine wildlife. A mountain lion sniffing around, a mother bear with her cub, a couple of javelinas, a ringtail cat with sad-looking eyes. Ordinary stuff, for someone who does this often enough. Then, on the night of December 20th, something walked past his lens from about 6 feet away. Miller described the moment simply as he gasped, because sitting right there, close enough to touch, was what he called the holy grail of big cats. A jaguar. Arizona Game and Fish confirmed what that sighting meant. According to Mark Hart, the department's public information officer in Tucson, that cat marked the 8th individual jaguar spotted in the wild in the United States since the 1990s. Not the 8th sighting, the 8th different cat. Hart put the rarity in blunt terms. Historically, Arizona sees somewhere between 3 and 5 jaguars appear every 10 to 100 years. 8 confirmed individuals in 3 decades isn't just unusual. It's a pattern nobody fully expected to see repeat itself this fast. Here's what makes this genuinely strange and worth sitting with for a second. Jaguars are not supposed to be an American animal anymore. They were pushed out of the country decades ago, hunted and squeezed out of habitat until the population north of the border was almost completely wiped clean. For most of the 20th century, if you wanted to see a wild jaguar, you had to go south, deep into Mexico, or further, into Central and South America. The idea of one padding through an Arizona canyon sounded like folklore, and yet here they are. Not just Cinco and Miller's mystery cat, but a running tally that now sits at 8, maybe 9, depending on which agency's count you use, since the Center for Biological Diversity has tracked slightly different numbers going back to 1996. Either way, the pattern holds. These cats keep showing up, and scientists are only beginning to understand why, and what it means that this is happening now. So the real question isn't whether jaguars are coming back. The cameras have already answered that. The real question is how deep this goes, how long it's been quietly happening, and whether anyone is actually paying attention before it's too late to matter. Think about what that number actually represents for a second. 8 different jaguars, each one a young male that made the decision, somewhere in Sonora, to keep walking north past the point where most of his species stops, crossing a river, climbing through mountain passes, moving mostly at night, avoiding roads, avoiding people, covering distances that would exhaust most hikers in a matter of days. None of them had a map, they just kept going, the same way jaguars have probably been doing for centuries, long before anyone called it a border at all. And the timing of these two encounters, Schnauffer's watering hole footage and Miller's 6-foot close encounter, matters more than it might seem at first glance. They happened only a few months apart, in 2 completely different mountain ranges, caught by 2 completely different people who had no idea the other's camera existed. That's not one lucky break. That's 2, landing almost back to back, in a state where researchers used to consider a single confirmed jaguar sighting a career highlight. It's worth remembering that neither Schnauffer nor Miller are trained biologists chasing a grant. One's a volunteer who hikes for the love of it. The other checks his cameras the way most people check a mailbox expecting nothing, most days getting nothing. That's exactly what makes their footage so credible. Nobody was out there hunting for a headline. They just happened to be standing in the right patch of desert when history walked past. The cat who vanished without a trace. Before there was Cinco, there was El Jefe. And if you want to understand why researchers get so worked up over a grainy trail camera clip, you need to understand what happened to him. El Jefe was first spotted in 2011.
Jaguar named El Jefe was spotted in Mexico. He's been known to roam throughout southern Arizona, but hadn't been seen for years until now.
The very first jaguar the Wildcat Research and Conservation Center managed to document as part of its long-term monitoring effort. For a few years, he became something close to a local celebrity. He was regularly caught on camera moving through the same general territory, a home range that researchers eventually mapped across the Santa Rita and Rincon Mountains, not far from Tucson. Hikers, researchers, and eventually the wider public followed his story. Here was tangible, repeated proof that a top predator, one of the most elusive cats on the planet, was living quietly in America's backyard. Then, in 2015, he disappeared. No dramatic ending, no confirmed carcass, no clear cause. He simply stopped showing up. The cameras that used to catch him every few weeks went quiet. Researchers now believe he likely wandered back south, crossing the border again into the Mexican state of Sonora, where the deeper, more connected jaguar populations of the Sierra Madre still exist. It's the most logical explanation, but logical isn't the same as certain. Nobody can say for sure. He just walked out of the story. That gap, that uncertainty is the whole tension of this situation. Jaguars in the American Southwest are almost always male. Researchers have tracked 5 different individuals through the Wildcat Center's monitoring work since 2011, and every single one has been male. That's not a coincidence. Young male jaguars are the dispersers of their species, the ones who wander furthest from where they were born, searching for new territory and, eventually, mates. Females tend to stay closer to established, stable populations. So when a jaguar shows up in Arizona, it's very likely a young male pushing the edge of his species range as far north as it will go, which means every single cat documented in Arizona over the last 3 decades, Cinco, El Jefe, a jaguar named Sombra, spotted in the Chiricahua Mountains.
Arizona Game and Fish says it's safe to assume Sombra is a male based off past trends, but if it's a female, it'd be the first one documented.
And all the others has, as far as anyone can tell, been alone. No mate, no cubs, no breeding population. Just solitary males passing through, using Arizona as a temporary range before either moving on or vanishing the way El Jefe did. Here's the detail that stops most people cold. The last confirmed wild female jaguar in the United States was recorded in 1963, over 60 years ago. Historical records, old photographs, hunting logs, and reports dating back before 1920 suggest jaguars once did more than pass through. There's evidence that females and even subadult cats existed in the region, which raises the real possibility that jaguars once bred as far north as Arizona, maybe even close to the Grand Canyon. That's not myth. That's documented range history. So somewhere between then and now, the breeding population disappeared entirely, and what's left is this strange, quiet trickle of lone males wandering north out of Mexico, showing up on camera for a few years, and then, like El Jefe, sometimes just walking back out of the story completely. It's worth pausing on that image for a second. A 150 to 250 pound apex predator, capable of the strongest bite force of any cat on Earth, strong enough to swim rivers and climb cliffs, and it's been reduced to a single, solitary traveler, crossing an international border in the dark, searching for a home that mostly isn't there anymore. Cinco is currently living that same story. Whether his ending looks like El Jefe's disappearance or something else entirely is something nobody can predict yet. But the pattern from the last 15 years gives a pretty good hint of what usually comes next. 15 years, 8 cats, one impossible pattern. Susan Malusa has spent more than a decade staring at grainy night vision footage, trying to answer one question: is this really happening, or are we just getting lucky with a few wandering cats? As director of the University of Arizona's Wildcat Research and Conservation Center, she's the person closest to the data, and her answer is clear. This isn't luck, it's a pattern. Since 2011, her team has confirmed 5 different jaguars moving through the Sky Island mountain ranges of southern Arizona. Combined, those 5 cats have been detected on camera more than 240 times. That's not one lucky photo. That's 240 separate moments where a wild jaguar walked in front of a hidden lens in the United States. And the pace isn't slowing down, it's speeding up. Since August 2025 alone, the center has confirmed 7 new detections, a burst of activity that has researchers paying closer attention than ever. Malusa doesn't talk about these sightings the way a tourist might talk about a rare bird. She talks about them as data points inside a much bigger, decades-long scientific record. Each detection helps confirm something researchers have long suspected but struggled to prove with hard evidence: that the ecosystem connecting Arizona to northern Mexico is still alive, still functional, and still capable of moving a top predator across hundreds of miles of rugged terrain. That connection has a name: the Sky Islands. These are isolated mountain ranges that rise up out of the surrounding desert, like, well, islands. For some species, they're a trap, cutting off populations and forcing genetic isolation. But for wide-ranging animals like jaguars, they work the opposite way. They act as stepping stones, a natural corridor linking the mountains of southern Arizona to the much larger, more connected Sierra Madre range in Mexico. Follow that chain of mountains far enough south, and you eventually connect to jaguar populations that are stable, breeding, and healthy. In other words, Arizona isn't some random destination these cats stumble into by accident. It's the literal northern tip of a living highway that jaguars have almost certainly been using for centuries, long before anyone put up a camera to record it. This is where the science gets genuinely exciting, and also genuinely fragile. A corridor only works if it stays connected. Break it in enough places, and the highway stops functioning, cats can no longer move through, populations can't mix, and the northernmost edge of the species range, which is exactly where Arizona sits, quietly closes for good. Government agencies have already recognized how much this corridor matters, at least on paper. In 2014, the Center for Biological Diversity secured federal protection for thousands of acres specifically dedicated to jaguar habitat recovery. That protection was a milestone. It meant, officially, that the United States government recognized jaguars as a species worth safeguarding within its own borders.
As the United States continues extending barriers along the Mexican border, the jaguar, whose population growth depends on free movement,
Not just somewhere far to the south. But protection on paper and protection on the ground are two very different things, especially when the very land in question sits directly on an active, heavily contested international border. And that's exactly where this story takes its darkest turn, because everything the data says about connectivity, about corridors, about a fragile but functioning highway between two countries is currently running headlong into a construction project that doesn't care about any of it. There's another layer to this that rarely makes the headlines. Camera trap data isn't just a tally of sightings, it's a slow-motion map of behavior. Researchers can compare where a cat like Cinco shows up against where El Jefe and Sombra were seen years earlier, and start piecing together which canyons, which water sources, and which mountain passes these animals actually rely on. That kind of detail can't come from a single dramatic photo. It comes from 240 repeated detections, patiently logged over 15 years by people willing to hike miles off trail just to swap a memory card. That patience is exactly why Melusa treats every new detection as more than a headline moment. Each one is a puzzle piece. Put enough of them together, and a real picture starts to emerge, not of isolated, lucky encounters, but of a living, functioning wildlife corridor that has quietly kept working long after most people assumed it had been severed for good. A wall built through the only door they have. Here's the uncomfortable part of this story. Everything that makes Arizona's jaguar comeback possible, the Sky Islands, the mountain corridors, the fragile thread connecting the U.S. to Mexico's healthier jaguar populations, sits directly in the path of ongoing border wall construction. Russ McSpadden has watched this collision happen in real time. As the Southwest conservation advocate for the Center for Biological Diversity, he's spent years documenting jaguar sightings in the same mountains where construction crews are now active. His reaction to the most recent Cinco footage wasn't just excitement about a rare animal, it was a warning. He said plainly that jaguars belong in the American Southwest, and that their northern range is being torn apart not by one single cause, but by a stack of pressures happening all at once. Wall construction, mining activity, groundwater depletion, and a drought made worse by a changing climate. The wall itself is the most visible threat, and the most literal one. Plans are already underway for a secondary, double-layered wall running along most of the state's southern border. For a mountain lion, a bobcat, or a black bear, a wall segment might mean a detour. For a jaguar, an animal that depends on covering enormous connected home ranges to find food, territory.
Southern United States, the predator is emblematic, but its survival is threatened by illegal hunting, habitat loss, and more recently, expanding barriers along the US-Mexico border.
And eventually a mate, a solid, unbroken wall, can mean something far more permanent. It can mean the corridor closes entirely. McSpadden has been direct about how he sees the wall's value against its cost, calling a secondary structure extremely wasteful, especially when set against what's actually at stake ecologically. Whether or not you agree with the politics behind that comment, the ecological logic behind it is hard to dismiss. You can't have a functioning wildlife corridor and an impenetrable, uninterrupted wall in the same place. The two things cancel each other out. And the wall isn't operating alone. Mining projects continue to expand into the same Sky Island ranges the jaguars use to travel. Groundwater depletion, driven partly by agriculture and partly by growing desert communities, is drying out the same watering holes that cats like Cinco depend on to survive the region's brutal heat. Climate-driven drought is compounding all of it, shrinking the margin for error even further in an ecosystem that was already stretched thin. Put those pressures together, and you get a strange, almost cruel irony sitting at the center of this whole story. Right now, in 2026, more individual jaguars are being documented in Arizona than at almost any point in recorded history. 8 confirmed cats, 7 new detections in less than a year, cameras catching moments researchers once thought they'd never witness. And at the exact same moment, the physical corridor that made all of it possible is being actively cut apart, piece by piece, by construction crews working just miles from where Cinco was filmed drinking water in the dark. It raises a question that doesn't have a comfortable answer yet. Is this current wave of sightings the beginning of a real comeback, proof that jaguars are slowly reclaiming a piece of their old range? Or is it the last flicker of activity before the door closes for good, a final burst of cats finding their way north right before the path behind them gets sealed off entirely? Nobody, not even the researchers who've spent 15 years tracking this, can say for certain which version of the story is unfolding. But there's one group that isn't waiting around to find out. There's a strange kind of timing at play here too. Wall segments don't go up overnight, and neither do mining permits or groundwater agreements. Each of these pressures has been building for years, moving through construction schedules, permitting offices, and budget approvals, mostly out of public view.
President Trump has resumed building the border wall.
As of today, we're starting 7 new miles of construction.
When President Biden took office, he immediately stopped wall construction.
Meanwhile, jaguars have kept crossing, kept showing up on cameras, seemingly unaware that the ground beneath their usual routes is being negotiated away in meetings hundreds of miles from the mountains they call home. That mismatch, a slow-moving bureaucratic process running in parallel with a slow-moving ecological one, is part of what makes this moment so precarious. Neither side is moving fast enough to notice the other until construction crews and camera traps end up practically in the same canyon. The sacred animal nobody's fighting for. Long before trail cameras, before federal habitat protections, before anyone measured jaguar range in acres or GPS coordinates, this animal already had a name and a place in this land. The Tohono O'odham Nation calls the jaguar O-Shad. And in 2025, the San Xavier district of the nation made something official that had, in practice, been true for generations. The San Xavier district passed a resolution formally recognizing the jaguar as a sacred animal. It wasn't a symbolic gesture without teeth. The resolution specifically called for stronger habitat protections, the restoration of wildlife corridors, the very same corridors researchers like Susan Malusa have spent 15 years documenting, and even the eventual reintroduction of jaguars across parts of their historic range in the American Southwest. District Chairman Austin Nunez explained the reasoning in terms that go far beyond biology. To the Tohono O'odham, jaguars aren't simply a rare, photogenic predator worth protecting, because a camera occasionally catches one drinking at a watering hole. They're described as protectors of the people, woven into spiritual life and into the nation's connection to the land itself. That's a very different frame than the one most wildlife stories get told through. This isn't just about population numbers or corridor science. It's about a relationship between a community and an animal that predates every camera, every research center, and every border wall currently being built through the same mountains. That distinction matters because it reframes the entire stakes of this story. If jaguars vanish from Arizona again, the way El Jefe vanished in 2015, the way the breeding population apparently vanished sometime after 1963, it isn't just a wildlife statistic. It isn't just a line disappearing off a research center's tracking chart. It's the erasure of something a community has already formally declared sacred, something tied to their spiritual life and identity, happening in real time, in the same canyons where researchers are still finding new footage. And here's the part that should genuinely unsettle anyone paying attention. Jaguars aren't just a single species worth saving for their own sake. Conservationists describe them as an umbrella species, meaning their presence or absence acts as a barometer for the overall health of an entire ecosystem. If the habitat is intact enough to support a jaguar, an animal that needs vast, connected, undisturbed territory to survive, it's very likely healthy enough to support dozens of other species living underneath that same umbrella. Black bears, mountain lions, ringtails, deer, and the smaller creatures that depend on all of them. So when a camera catches Cinco walking past at 8:47 p.m. or catches an unnamed 8th jaguar standing 6 feet from Jason Miller's lens in the dark, it isn't just a wildlife moment worth a headline. It's a signal, flashing in real time, about whether an entire cross-border ecosystem, one that scientists, a sovereign nation, and a handful of dedicated volunteers have all separately concluded is worth protecting, still has a future. Right now, that signal is flickering. 8 cats confirmed, 7 detections in less than a year, a resolution passed, federal habitat protections already on the books since 2014, and, running directly through the middle of all of it, active construction on a wall that doesn't distinguish between people and predators. Whether this becomes the decade Jaguars finally came home, or the decade the door quietly shut for good, depends on choices being made right now, not by the cats, but by the people standing on either side of that border. There's also a quieter, more practical piece to the San Xavier resolution that's worth mentioning. Formal recognition from a sovereign nation carries legal and political weight that a research center's tracking data, on its own, doesn't always have. It gives conservation advocates like McSpadden another avenue to push back against unchecked construction, another voice in rooms where decisions about the border, the wall, and the land itself actually get made. In a fight this uneven, a handful of researchers and volunteers against large-scale federal construction projects, that kind of institutional backing matters more than it might first appear. So where does that leave Cinco and the 7 cats before him? Right now, he's still out there somewhere in those same mountains, moving quietly between 2 countries that can't agree on what to build between them. History says he might vanish the way El Jefe did, without warning, without an ending. Or he might be the first sign of something bigger finally taking root. Nobody knows yet, and that's the honest, uncomfortable truth of this story. If this kind of real, ongoing mystery keeps you hooked, hit subscribe so you don't miss what the next camera catches. Drop a comment and tell me, do you think jaguars are finally coming home, or are we watching the last of them disappear? I'll see you in the next one.